Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar presentation brought to you by English Australia, but in partnership with many of our stakeholders from across the sector. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of our English Australia members, but also the members from NEAS who are also joining us here today. Today's session, the return to compliance, was brought about by an announcement made back in 19th of October from our two main regulators, from ASQA and TEQSA, who noted the return to compliance for ESOS National Code for the 30th of June 2023. As we all have been aware, and I think have sincerely appreciated, international education has had a difficult period during the period of the border closures, but the support that we've received from the Department of Education, from ASQA and TEQSA has been immensely valuable and incredibly considerate to give us this period of time to work through ways outside of the traditional settings in our legislative framework to enable innovation, to enable common sense, and to support the safety of our students, our staff, and the broader community. As we're all aware, though, there has been a retraction of those COVID-related initiatives and measures across all sectors within Australia. It seems timely and indeed appropriate that we now look to what those settings would be for international education, and particularly for the ELICOS sector moving forward. This session, we're very fortunate to be joined by the Department of Education, ASQA and TEQSA, with key representatives to provide some updates on where things are at the moment, but also to respond to many of the questions that you've raised as part of the process of setting up this webinar for today. Thank you to everyone that did take the time to put your question in. We've used those questions to shape some of the content for the responses in the presentation, but equally we will address some of those questions directly as well. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where we're meeting today across all of our nation. I pay my respect to our elders, past and present and emerging, and all of those that have come before us and will come after. Today, we're going to have the format where we'll commence with an update and overview from the Department of Education. Then we'll go into some questions and an update from ASQA, and followed by that, an update from our colleagues at TEQSA. During the presentation, we'll try to keep the introductions and bios relatively brief to enable time for the responses themselves. But first of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome Dr. David Atkins. David is the Assistant Secretary for the Quality Branch of International Division of the Australian Government Department of Education. David's held many roles across the department, and including schools, early childhood, childcare and corporate areas, and he's worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. David's been a very close and collaborative partner with English Australia and to our sector, and we're very fortunate to have David here with us to give us an update from the Department of Education. Thank you, and over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Brett, for your introduction. And can I associate myself with your acknowledgement of country, joining you as I do from Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands here in Canberra. It has been a bit of a wild ride the last 3 years, particularly with all the COVID business that we've all dealt with, but none have had a more challenging ride in our sector than the ELICOS providers. Although I'm very heartened to be able to say that as of September, for the year to date, 2023 to September, commencements are up more than 100%, so 101% increase in commencements. There's still a long way to go. That's still about 17% down on the same period in 2020, but it's a really fabulous start. And ultimately, that's really what we all want to do, is to have a strong and vibrant ELICOS sector full of eager students. The Department of Education's role in ESOS really is something like an architect. Formally, we administer the Act of Parliament, the Education Services for Overseas Students Act, which enables the international education sector. So when I say we're like an architect, we administer that act. We are not a regulator ourselves. Our regulators for ELICOS are ASQA and TEQSA. However, we think about how all the framework works. We think about whether we've got the balance of things right. And so early on in the pandemic, when ASQA and TEQSA moved to suspend compliance with some elements of the National Code, particularly Standard 8, we were wanting to be right there with ASQA and TEQSA to support them to do that and make it clear that as the sort of architect of the framework, we thought that was a really important thing to do. And equally, now that we're seeing the sector recover and we are seeing strong movements of students back to Australia, we think that ASQA and TEQSA's announcement that from the middle of next year will return to compliance is an appropriate and important thing that we will also strongly support. But we are really here as, if you like, the owners of the framework, and they're thinking about how all the pieces of that framework fit together. And as my job title suggests, ultimately we come at that with a quality lens. What's good for quality? Because quality is what gives our sector and our country comparative advantage and comparable advantage. During the course of 2022, we have conducted a review of the ESOS framework. And I'd like to thank English Australia through Brett for putting in a very thoughtful and far-reaching submission to that review. The review has been conducted, and we will use the submissions and the information that we gathered through that review to inform our ongoing program of legislative reform for ESOS. And one of the questions we asked in that review that will be in one of our early tranches of consideration for reform will be, what is the appropriate metric and balance for online education in our sector? The National Code as a whole currently sets a limit of 30% online, and I think it will be good and proper and timely to review that. And before any consideration is made to legislative reform, I can assure you that there will be strong and wide-ranging consultation on that. Informing that consideration and informing this return to legislative compliance that we have, that we're working with ASQA and TEQSA on, and working with the sector, working with you all on, has been 2 rounds of the Innovation Fund. So the Innovation Fund was a support measure provided by the government, which was intended to support fast tracking of new and innovative teaching methods, particularly considering online and other modes of learning and instruction. And we are certainly keen that the innovations that have been a hallmark of a vibrant and resilient sector, as the ELICOS sector is, inform our regulatory considerations moving forward. Now, with the move to returning to regulatory compliance, we certainly will also want that the learnings and the innovation that have been part of the last 2 years to inform our thinking. One of the things that I certainly have on my mind is whether the current version of the ELICOS standards that form part of that ESOS framework are fit for purpose in this new world in which we find ourselves, and how they might be, how we might advise government that they might be adapted to reflect the learnings and the innovations that that we have all had over these last 2 and a bit years, 3 years. So it's certainly very much on our mind, and really a perfect day for this session for me would be to hear a lot of feedback on what you, as members of English Australia, members of NEAS, and members of the ELICOS sector, think about how we can best structure our return to compliance. And before I hand back to Brett, I just want to give a bit of an apology. I might move around a bit, or might even turn my camera off occasionally. I've got a crook shoulder, and occasionally I have to lie on the floor and let it reset. So if I have my camera off, I can assure you I'm listening hard. But that's just one of those things. So Brett, with that, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, David, and certainly do appreciate that information in terms of the overview around the ESOS review. Certainly in terms of the questions, that there were questions raised around the outcomes from the ESOS review. So it's certainly good to know that process has been taken into consideration, and the way in which the department's working on key findings as well as the ministerial briefings, as you noted. David, if I may, just before we move on, you touched upon an element around course delivery, and particularly one that was noted as a question or noted many times in terms of the question we received. In this period of flexibility, early cost providers have essentially had the ability to move from what was face-to-face entirely, the 20 hours per week, and within the parameters of ensuring student outcomes, had quite a big scope to move that indeed up to a fully online component. Is there any thinking in terms of at the moment, even in a very general term, what the future could be if there was alignment in terms of that Standard 8 requirement?
It's a great question, Brett. As always, you ask the good questions. We have given some early thoughts, and by way of background, I think really the face-to-face requirement that currently exists in the ELICOS standard, I think really has come from two places. One is, many teachers traditionally would favour face-to-face learning. There's nothing like being able to sort of walk around the classroom and read the body language, as it were. So partly that, but also it's really a way of thinking about quality. It's a shorthand for quality. So what we'll want to be thinking about is, how do we think about quality in other ways, and what are other ways that we can achieve quality that perhaps better reflect the realities of the last couple of years and the learnings of the last couple of years, what constitutes quality. One version of that, and it's only one, and we haven't landed on thinking yet. And as I said, we will want to consult, and this is part of that consultation, would be, rather than specifying a mode of delivery in the standard, do you specify that written agreements with students have to be very transparent and clear about what modes of delivery are? It could look something like that. There are other things it could look like. We know that the ELICOS sector, one of its hallmarks is its commitment to quality, and so really just what's the best way of capturing that commitment of quality in a regulatory instrument, that legislative instrument that reflected in the ELICOS standards. So it's certainly one option, and it goes to one of the other questions we asked in the ESOS review that we had some fabulous feedback from English Australia and others on, was about the role of transparency to drive quality. So we're sort of thinking about in those sorts of terms.
Yeah, thank you, David. So I think just in sort of brief summary would be picking up on your earlier point, and this is coming through in a number of questions, and indeed we do have the chat available for people online if there are questions that you would like to raise for the session as well, where we would like to have that interaction. But in the first instance, looking at the ELICOS standards, any movement would only be to the alignment with what was in that national code. I'm assuming from your first comment in Standard 8. So the 30% or that component, it would be around potentially, and again, we're noting your comments around the need for consultation and review and ways to look at quality measures, but it would be within the period or within the framework of what would apply to all programs potentially.
Yeah. So our thinking is that the primary legislation requires passage of Parliament, so that would take a very long time to change, and we will think about that. The National Code takes not as long as that, but longer to change. The ELICOS standard is something which can be subject to consideration of government change more quickly, and the ELICOS standard is currently, I think, the most prescriptive of those three instruments. So, if we're able to consult, come with way forward, and then talk to government about that ELICOS standard can be changed relatively quickly, but then changes National Code is something which we would want to consult more widely on, and probably pick up a few things together rather than just single pieces. And so we anticipate that would take a bit longer, but that ELICOS standard in principle can be changed relatively quickly, subject to consultation with the sector and obviously decisions of government.
Thanks, David. And I'm conscious I've got my other colleagues online. One last and final question, only because it sort of does segue into a number of points that were raised ahead of the session. On that matter of timing, and I think you very clearly articulated there, particularly in regard to potential amendments to the ELICOS standards, because of the way in which they are nested within the legislative framework, that could potentially happen a little quicker. And the questions are mainly that, these changes would happen prior to the 30th, or is there of June? Because obviously providers are keen to know and ensure that they'd be meeting any obligations and have time if they needed to make any changes. So if there's any broad indicative timeframes or guidance, that would be appreciated as well.
Sure. And because these things ultimately are decisions of government, very hard for us to nail down timeframes, but we would certainly want to have any changes to the ELICOS standard in place well ahead of the return to compliance, so that people have time to see and adapt. But I can't put more. I'd love to be able to say it'll be by X month, but it's out of my hands a bit. So, but we would certainly, we totally hear that the longer people have to know what if the standard moves, the longer they have to adapt to that, the better everyone will be, and the smoother it'll be. And that's what we want, a smooth transition that is easy for people. And we totally hear that the longer we can give people, that the more notice we can give them ahead of that 30th of June cut over to compliance, the better it is for everyone, including for us.
Thank you, David. Some really, really valuable points in there. And again, just noting your comments around Standard 8, potentially how that could, any changes would need to then be reflected in written agreements, and potentially as a way in which that would cover mode of delivery, the alignment potentially with Standard 8 requirements. There's some other comments coming in we'll pick up, but thank you also for noting that one of the things you would like to see is around good practice, and that's something that I think, given the innovations over the past few years and the way in which we've always communicated a commitment to ensuring student outcomes were met regardless of mode delivery, I think that's something we could follow up on post the session. So, David, I'm going to let you take a break, and I'm going to hand over to another exceptional colleague of ours at ASQA. Christina Bolger is the Deputy CEO, of ASQA, which was a newly appointed role back in September 2020. Christina has experience across the Australian public service, policy and regulation, with experience in a range of areas, including health, rehabilitation, quality and safety. Christina's been a great stakeholder, and her, along with Saxon Rice, the CEO, have really shown a commitment to working with the sector through their provider liaison groups and our peak bodies, as well as the other particularly stakeholder liaison groups too, which has been wonderful to see. So, Christina, could I please hand over to you? And I do know that you're also joined by your colleague, Alicia Roy, who's the Acting Executive Director for Policy and Partnerships, formerly the Director of Review and Appeals. and has a wonderful and distinguished legal career as well. So thank you, Alicia, for joining us. So Christina, Alicia, over to you.
Thanks very much, Brett, and hello to everyone. I'd just like to start by just acknowledging that the English language intensive courses for overseas students play such an important role in Australia's international education sector, and also acknowledge the significant adjustments and the resilience of the sector through COVID, and the innovation and the changes that have been responded to through that very difficult time. It's also good to hear from David in relation to some of the conversations that we've been having in relation to the policy settings. And I think from ASQA's perspective, we're really attuned to dimensions of risk as the regulator, and acknowledging that this is a priority area, international students for us. We have really been attuned to dimensions of regulatory risk in the international student cohort, and that for a number of reasons is one of our regulatory risk priorities this year. And we really proactively seek to manage those risks within our functions and in partnership with others, because we have a shared interest in seeing that those risks are managed for the reputation of quality vet and the outcomes we're all seeking for international education. So, on the back of those relaxed requirements that David mentioned earlier, in relation to adjustments during COVID to provide on a temporary basis some relief from those settings that required face-to-face delivery. We've now, as you know, released the joint statement or the shared position with TEQSA around our expectation that providers transition back to compliance with the National Code and ESOS standards by 30th of June next year. So this position from ASQA's perspective really recognises both, pleased to hear from David the latest figures on that gradual return of international students, but also that the risks associated with online delivery are changing and shifting because of the maturity journey that the sector has been on through that COVID period. And we really do acknowledge providers across both VET and CRICOS and ELICOS have really made significant progress in those areas, and the investment in the infrastructure and the capability to deliver online training and to ensure outcomes are being achieved. Some of those lessons will have lasting change, I think, in the sector. And so the question does become, what revisions to the policy settings are needed in order to move forward. But we also acknowledge that there are different levels of maturity, and whilst we are seeing that innovation, we also need to ensure that the bottom setting actually mitigates risk. And some of the settings in face-to-face are actually there to mitigate some of the risks in relation to poor practice or poor student outcomes. So I think that's the piece that we have to get to a sharper definition of what will do that, and what other ways could achieve that. So what other provider practices could provide stronger assurance? What would we be looking for, and how could we understand that, even leaning into some of the other provisions under the ESOS Act that potentially can provide a stronger assurance of student welfare and outcomes? So we really are now leaning into our understanding of what's happened over the COVID period, and a really sentinel piece for us there has been the strategic review of online learning. And we have iteratively published those findings on our website, and are shortly to publish the final report, which is sort of wrapping up all of that work. And really, I think both that piece, but also other research, including that English Australia's own research, is really pointing to that rapid transition to online meant that providers, trainers, assessors and students had to really shift and pivot and make changes to practice. And whilst that has been done well in some places, there are different levels of maturity still across the sector in relation to that. And alongside the really good practice, there's also risks coexisting with that that we've drawn out in our strategic review. And they are really things like, making sure that risks for online delivery for students, the preparation and student support to undertake learning online, sufficiently taken into account the students' literacy, the language, numeracy, their digital skills, and so on, even learning styles, being equipped to meet the delivery mode's technological requirements for participation, in many cases, that not being there as a sort of baseline. Students not being informed of or sufficiently understanding the mode of delivery being offered. So that goes to requirements around clarity of agreements and so on. And risks relating to the actual training and assessment, which were quite broad in terms of the literacy skills of trainers and assessors themselves. And I know there's been a lot of work there in the course that's been offered, and English Australia has had a key role in providing that training over this period. The type of training and assessment that might not be suitable for delivery online, that more broadly leaning into the vet sector, of course, in relation to that, and meeting the requirements of various training products was one of the other key things. And I think, those checks and balances that we would be seeking to see, and, we can have some further conversations, but really interested in actually also hearing from practitioners through the coming months about how we can better understand that and lean into focusing on assurances around the level of confidence that we can have for student outcomes, irrespective of the mode of delivery. So I might just pause there, David.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I think it's quite interesting, because even as the part of the process on collecting questions ahead of today's webinar, we received quite a lot of comments, and many of those comments actually were very much aligned to the points you've made around the risks and what risks and mitigations could be put in place, and particularly moving forward, if there was a continuation in terms of online and online study being part of that program of course delivery, what is the way in which those risks could be potentially mitigated? I think you've given a very nice and broad overview of some of those key considerations of good practice, and indeed English Australia, in releasing our guide to good practice in online, picked up on many of those themes, the teaching support, the student support, technology infrastructure as well. And that was to try and enable people to move into course delivery and showcase through some of the examples of good practice. Question from sort of part of the process from members ahead of the session was around what regulatory controls or mechanisms could you or would you be looking for in terms of online learning if it was to continue? Are there any particular types of elements in that system that you think would be something that would be key to be able to mitigate or at least have some control over risk?
Yeah, I think, on a practical level over the coming months, we're really expecting to see some progress towards that return to face-to-face, and really thinking about mitigating risks during that transition period, looking for what support we can provide in terms of building provider capability for self-assurance, and really focusing on those assurances that would be strategies for monitoring student outcomes under the requirements. So being able to demonstrate student outcomes irrespective of the mode of delivery. The things that give us assurance around the achievement of those learning outcomes across, face-to-face and online. So really across all modes and methods of delivery, I think if we actually look at the standards themselves, you can almost drop down and ask that additional question about the assurance for and the context for delivery in an online setting. I think there's things around the trainers and assessors themselves and their level of competency and being equipped to deliver in a online environment. So, again, that leans into the experience and qualifications of course teachers, and there's things in that space that would provide assurance, such as the completion of the online training courses, and even things like the NEAS accreditation and things like that. So, it's asking those levels of questions that go to what assurances providers can provide around the outcomes being delivered in those online settings.
Thanks very much, Christine. I think that's very clear and concise, and just picking up on the work that ASQA has done over the last couple of years, but particularly this year in the development of those self-assurance, or the self-assurance framework. And I think you very nicely referred to those elements of the staff capability and ongoing development, which again, from sort of the peak body's perspective, we know that there's a lot of teachers returning to the sector now. Indeed, teacher recruitment is a major focus of many providers as we start to recover, and the appetite and the uptake into the courses which we've been supported to release in online delivery and hybrid delivery and resources in line. We've had many hundreds of teachers sign up to those programs in a very short period of time. So, I think there is an appetite, but we do need to ensure they join the dots. For those who haven't had a chance, please do take the time. I think to have a look at ASQA's self-assurance model as they're moving down that process, sort of circled and refined around continuous improvement, the way in which that a provider has the governance structures in place that looks at those elements of staffing, leadership, good governance, student engagement, and their commitment as well, sort of as broad themes. But we can cover that off a bit more, but just wanted to acknowledge that, that there has been a considerable amount of work done and some good lead indicators from the department, ASQA, as to what could be considered in terms of those risk controls moving forward. Christina, I will move on now, if that's okay, and hand over to our colleagues from TEQSA. We have with us today 3 representatives coming to us from TEQSA, and we are joined by Mary. So we've got Dr. Mary Russell, who is the Executive Director of Regulatory Operations at TEQSA. Mary is being supported today. She has a fantastic background in terms of higher education provider support, and her team oversees and manages the regulatory risk for the agency. Her own experience in terms of working within broader sector includes working with the Ombudsman for dispute resolution and a number of years in executive roles with APRA. So brings a wealth of experience to this position in terms of her ways of looking at regulatory control systems. Mary will be joined by Sean Ryan, who's the Director of Re-Registration and CRICOS as part of the regulatory operations team. And also we have Jared Orth, who's the Assistant Director or Deputy Director, equally in the CRICOS registration team here to provide some support today. So thank you to the commitment from TEQSA also to be part of the panel. With time, I'll hand over to you now, I believe, Sean.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, everyone. It's been a great webinar thus far, and I'll skip through some notes so I'm not necessarily repeating some of David and Christine's content. I just wanted to sort of start with sort of our view of the sector and where we see it at the moment, and start with just the ESOS framework and the TEQSA Act are strongly focused on the interests of overseas students, and particularly for overseas students in the ESOS framework, and also for protecting and enhancing Australia's reputation for quality education. Just to echo Christina's observations, TEQSA similarly is moving more towards wanting to see evidence of providers self-assurance activities rather than prescribing evidence or sort of dictating what compliance looks like in each and every instance. So just those sort of overarching things when we talk about what we're seeing. So we acknowledge that the impact of the COVID pandemic has been significant across the sector, and particularly for ASQA, and just wanted to sort of acknowledge the huge amount of effort and innovation and creativity that's gone into responding and maintaining quality in that regard. Similarly, TEQSA, as the regulator, we need to be anticipating and responding to changes from a regulatory perspective. So we really welcome forums like this to communicate with you, hear the concerns, but also put across our point of view. For those who attended TEQSA's conference last week, I think it was a really strong message from us that we expect to see providers have really strong institutional arrangements to enable them to be assuring themselves that they're identifying and then taking appropriate actions to mitigate those risks. And we expect overall that governing bodies, that that it's not just a little compliance and quality is not just a sideshow, that it's the governing bodies are actively engaged in this and are across it and are fulfilling their own obligations to be managing this, the regulatory compliance. So with that background, we really want to be emphasising that we want you to be engaging with international students to ensure as early as possible to provide them with clear and complete information, and that student services don't just exist in name, that they are well-resourced and that they're meeting students' wellbeing needs. I think it was a really clear message for us from the TEQSA conference that we heard that there are substantial areas for improvement in this regard. We heard from student voices and community groups, particularly around international students, that we need to get better in that space. So the other part of it, as we're now moving back to something similar in terms of international student numbers to pre-COVID times, we understand that the providers are looking at new markets and looking to innovate in the products that they're offering and engaging with new student cohorts and delivery partners and recruitment agents. And we really expect you to be identifying the risks involved in using offshore education agents and how they market your institution, how they recruit students, particularly in areas where you have limited experience in that market or limited relationship with those education agents. We expect and we hope that you're actively and systematically managing your network of education agents to ensure that they're providing students with the most up-to-date and most accurate information, and that you're also monitoring the performance of those agents with respect to their dealings with students, and that you're monitoring the extent to which they're providing you with genuine students. I think these are key risks that we've seen in recent, there's an extreme recent news stories with how badly that can go. But I think in terms of the risk to quality, I think this is an area that we think the sector, but ASQA as well, ASQA providers should be paying close attention to. We acknowledge that there's work going on that will, with the Department of Education and that the reform of the ESOS Act. Obviously, as a regulator, we regulate the standards that are in front of us, but we are looking forward to continuing the dialogue and the ongoing collaboration in this regard. And as the standards change, our regulatory posture will change for obvious reasons. Just bring up a slide I'll move now on to a sort of the main content today of returning to compliance. But I thought that'd be interesting perspective just to see the risks that we're seeing in the sector. I think that was one of the briefs that you gave. Brett, just one sec, I'll get this slide up. Okay. right, can everyone see the slide? Great. One theme I'm picking up today is the some concern about our announcement about just the broader return to compliance. I just want to clarify, it relates specifically to the flexibility that was offered surrounding the delivery mode. It's not a broader judgment about the quality of online delivery, and it doesn't reflect like a pejorative judgment on the actions that were taken by providers in difficult circumstances during this period. So our wording about return to compliance just reflects that the government's approach to flexibility was a regulatory setting that responded to temporary border measures that were preventing international students from travelling to Australia, and also domestic health restrictions in Australia that prevented or limited face-to-face modes of learning. The announcement really just reflects that those circumstances have changed substantially. Of course, the standards governing delivery under the ESOS framework have not changed, but we, of course, and when they do change, our regulatory posture will change. We're expecting that providers have assured themselves that arrangements during that period of flexibility have maintained the quality and standards for each of their courses. That's our expectation, and we don't have, at this stage, I think we're satisfied that there's been good effort and good intent made by the vast bulk of providers in the ALICOS area. But we do expect that all providers delivering courses under the ESOS framework will have already commenced or will soon commence their plans for transition to compliance by 30 June 2023. We really don't want you waiting until the 29th of June to start thinking about this. A return to compliance from our perspective is that we want to see you develop a transition plan that identifies, assesses and monitors student cohorts. And that transition may involve some students choosing to change their enrolment status to offshore or travelling to Australia to study in line with the usual requirements for holders of Australian student visas. That transition may involve students delaying their studies until they feel they're ready to travel, or deciding not to undertake studies with you. We expect you to be fair and transparent and provide complete information to students so that they can make informed choices about this. Our primary interest at this as a regulator is just ensuring that providers demonstrate good practice surrounding their governance and their decision-making in any changes that occur, either as part of a return to compliance or in response to any future changes to the ALICOS standards. As with our expectations and approach on all regulatory compliance matters, we expect you to provide, to identify risk, develop and monitor plans to mitigate that risk and ensure compliance, and report on progress through your academic and corporate governance processes. Those plans and decisions about the return to compliance must be auditable, and they must demonstrate appropriate management of any risks to students. So we expect that you would be taking a mature and considered approach to what is safe and practical, and it will be different for different student cohorts. I really want to emphasize here that the convenience to a student or to the provider or market imperatives for providers in continuing arrangements, they're not relevant considerations about whether the return to compliance is safe or practical. I'll just move to the next slide. This is probably, the first is probably a key point here, that your planning and decision-making in this regard, it needs to be auditable and needs to demonstrate that you're managing the risk to students and how you're making those decisions. And you should expect that we may ask for evidence of those processes and evidence of that decision-making, either as part of a cyclical registration assessment, or we may seek information separately where other concerns arise. We do have regular channels for contact with students, and sometimes that can be where we see sort of a pattern of student responses or student concerns to the way a provider is communicating with them, or the way that they're managing things like complaints or providing them with information that can be a very useful source for us. We really want you to be transparent, fair, and clear to your students about what this means. I appreciate this involves some difficult conversations, and it may not be arrangements that all students are entirely happy with, but there are some broad expectations around what a return to compliance looks like. I think I'll stop there and see if there's any specific questions or comments or concerns.
Thank you very much, Sean. I think that's again been a really comprehensive overview, and I think for me, there's probably the key outcome was around that reference to your ability or the provider's ability to have clearly documented, auditable information around their decision making around the time, and I think that's really valuable, and indeed that equally would apply in terms of the self-assurance model and the way in which good governance, I think, would be translated over to ASQA regulated providers as well. Okay, for everyone online, we've got just over 10 minutes of the session to go, and I've got a few questions that were raised ahead of the session that I'll just like to cover, as well as those that have come in through the chat and Q&A, which I'll aim to get through as well. Firstly, I think, what I just probably a more general question was raised a number of times ahead of the session was in the announcement, the joint announcement from ASQA and TEQSA, it just noted that the return to compliance 30 June 2023 with a reference around when it was safe to do so. And I guess with COVID actively spreading across the community at the moment, there was questions raised around that reference to what would be determined as safe to do so. Christina, could I perhaps lean on you for this one?
Yeah, sure. I think really we had that clause in there just because we acknowledged that we would always be guided by any particular public health directions. In that regard, it's actually moving to a different place in terms of those type of directions, but obviously there's still obligations on providers in terms of protecting health and safety of students and any other emerging public health risks. So we just wanted to acknowledge that. But I also think that Sean's point about what doesn't constitute safe and practical is also worth amplifying, because I think we would agree that those decisions, aren't really market-driven decisions or just at the convenience of students. We really would be saying that this is an exception if there were circumstances that we needed on a case-by-case basis to understand in relation to the provider circumstances.
Thank you. I think it's useful to have that context in both sides around the public health considerations, but also the whatnot. And again, that came through in a number of comments around what could be inferred as safe to do so as well. So I think as we move forward, that's something that we could work collectively on. Just sharing that information and disseminating that more broadly across the community, on both sides. One here that's come through previously in questions before, but also picked up as part of our chat Q&A. David, I think this one's over for you. The definitions of online delivery and distance learning in the National Code I guess are not consistent with sort of current or potentially future teaching practices. Noting your earlier comments around sort of the framework timeline, is this under consideration for updating within the National Code as well?
Brett, look, I think it will have to be. At the recent Australian International Education Conference, the most difficult question I got asked was almost an offhand one of, when you say online, what do you mean? And I'm not sure I can actually answer that question easily. So I think we do have to think about definitions and what we mean by them. I think we knew what we meant when we wrote that back in 2018, but the world's changed a bit. And so all the more reason for us to we're very keen to hear from practitioners on examples of good practice, and you understand that people may not want to do that in front of their industry colleagues who are also their industry competitors. So very happy to do that confidentially, either directly or through peak bodies. But I think we will have to look at that in the longer term. Yeah.
Thanks, David. One maybe just on a more practical term, and perhaps over to one of the regulators. It was around the material change forms, and indeed this does sort of start to get to the nuts and bolts of it. And perhaps if once we have some more clarity around where we will land in terms of any regulatory or policy change, this would become more clear. But it was in terms of moving back to face-to-face teaching, and particularly at that 30 June, is there a requirement from providers in terms of any practical documentation or material change forms?
I might start with that one. At the moment, we're just having a look at how we would better understand this transition period and what information might be required from providers in order that we can kind of do a sort of a stock take, potentially at the end of Q1 or something like that. So at the moment, I don't think we're currently planning for providers to report material change, but there might be, for example, a request for information that is allowing us to sort of draw a point in the sand and just understand the status of the progression, because that will help us to understand what further support the sector needs, where we're up to in relation to the policy settings. Tuning in midway will give us a real sense of what's happening, and I think inform the further actions. So not likely to be material change request, but it might be a request for information where we can tell us some specific questions, perhaps with your assistance, Brett, to really get that insight.
Thanks, Christina. I might try and couple a couple of questions into one here. David, I think in terms of one of the question was around sort of the return to compliance, and in some ways, when that was initially sort of perceived, and indeed I received a lot of inquiries after the announcements. It was, are we going back to where we were? And so I guess we've probably covered this through today, but are we going back to where we were in that respect?
So Brett, I think as the regulatory documents currently stand, we would. But what we're saying here is we want to hear from the sector where we could go, and then we'll work out. We'll talk to government and see what government wants to do, because ultimately the minister gets to make the call, where we'll land. But our propositions, or the proposition we're putting to the sector, is we don't go back to where we were, and we possibly through one or two steps go to a different place. So in the first instance, we do want to have a quick look at the ESOS standards, because that's the most restrictive part of the compliance or the regulatory documentation rather, for the sector. I think we would be, from my perspective, relatively comfortable if we went to the National Code version, the 30% version, for a while. But it's more out of the ESOS reform work, or ESOS review work rather, when we get to the ESOS reform part of it. In any case, we wanted to look at that figure as well, and that arrangement, but that would be a longer term thing with more consultation.
Thanks, David. And sorry, I'll stay with you, because the second part of my question, which came up prior and a couple of times in the chat, is it realistic that these changes would occur prior to the 30th of June?
In terms of amendments to the ESOS standards, changes prior to 30 June are entirely realistic. Changes to the National Code before 30 June are highly unlikely, but not impossible. But our intent around National Code changes would be to have more and broader consultation anyway, so people would have a pretty good idea of what we had in mind and when we had in mind to implement it. So the sector would have a very good idea. It'd be, we'd be very loud about what we had in mind, so that the sector had lots of time to think about it and tell us what it thought, we would be consulting widely. But on the ELICOS standard part, that once there's a meeting of minds, that can be done relatively quickly. Once there's a meeting of minds.
Excellent, David. Thank you. And just I think, paraphrasing your previous one, it's not necessarily looking to go back to where we were, but I think a previous comment around back to the future might be something that we're aiming to achieve.
Yeah, back to the future, not back to the past.
Back to the past. That's perfect. There's one that, again, we've got just a couple of minutes before we finish. It was part of our questions collated ahead of the session. Online delivery can be done via both asynchronous online learning or from synchronous online and indeed a mix of both that synchronous and asynchronous type learning modes. Is there a view or a preference that's already been thought through around these different modes of delivery? And second part, would the National Code pick up on these definitions when that review process was undertaken?
I certainly don't have a view on the level of specificity that would be appropriate to reflect in either the ELICOS standards or the National Code, and would be really keen to hear from people on that. Yeah, so really very open to thinking about that.
Thanks, David. And I think the last question was, I think that the interrelationship between obviously the definitions within or not within the code and that with online will be a point that I think the sector will be keen to talk through. Noting that, we, particularly with English Australia and the generous support from, the Department of Education for the Innovation Funds and Innovation Development Fund, we've been able to see some wonderful developments and innovations in delivery modes and some great examples of good practice. But, I think at the heart of it, it comes back to also Christina's earlier point around making sure the regulatory standards have that quality layer from the bottom up, and that any risk mitigation happens from the bottom up as well. The last one, and just picking up on something in the chat here, was around the number of students within a class. Has there been any consideration, or would there be consideration around class sizes?
Again, not something that we've given consideration to yet. Open to hearing, and take the point that depending upon the mode of delivery, that can vary. And I should note, when I talk about consultation with the sector, we mean, of course, primarily practitioners, but I also do mean consultation with my colleagues from ASQA and TEQSA. So it'll be a broad-ranging consultation.
Thanks. I've got the last minute. I'm going to try and rush it in. And David, just a quick point of clarification, again, through previous questions. What we're discussing is all related to onshore visa student holders, not related to offshore students? That's
right. ESOS only applies to 500 subclass visa holders, student visa holders. If someone does not have a student visa, ESOS doesn't come into the frame. Still it's not a bad set of benchmarks to apply to students who are entirely online or through T&E, but strictly does not apply.
Thank you. And our discussion today, as again, just a point of clarity, relates specifically to ELICOS and any component around foundation programs, which is acutely interlinked in many ways for our providers. That would be a separate discussion that we'd need to have as well, correct? Sorry, David.
I got muted too quickly. Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank David, Christina, Mary, Alicia, Sean, and Jared for your support in preparing today's session. Thank you to everyone who's participated today, either prior to the session in terms of your comments and questions, and through the chat and the Q&A. I know there's more questions rolling in now. Please do send them through to English Australia, and we're very happy to act as a filter to work with the department, to work with ASQA and TEQSA on this as an ongoing piece of consultation. And today is really the start of that. But thank you to each of the agencies, again, for your commitment to today's session and to working with English Australia and the broader stakeholder network in terms of ensuring we arrive at the appropriate place ahead of that date of 30th of June 2023. So very much appreciated, and thank you again for all of your time and support.
Thanks, Brett.